Parshas Shemini together, and we're going to see what David Schwartz of blessed memory, and we're studying in his memory. May his neshama have an ascent, if it's even impossible for him to go any higher, because he's the holiest of all Jews. So let's see what David writes about Parshas Shemini, since this passage deals with two main topics. The first topic talks about what happened on the eighth day. What is Shemini means the day 8. What happened on day 8, which was the day after the 7 days of the Miluim, meaning to say that the temple was inaugurated for 7 days, dedicated, and after the inauguration of the temple on day 8, that was the first day that the temple was open for business, and on that day, the temple suffered the sanctuary, I think, their terrible tragedy of the death of two of the sons of Aaron, the two older sons, Nadav and Avihu. I always am moved. There was, the first time you read this, it's just like incredibly sad. But I always think about it. Any untimely loss, I think about on this week's parasha, Aaron, on his greatest day, he suffered this tremendous tragedy. The day of his highest success, suffered this tremendous tragedy of the death of Nadav and Avihu. And the second part of the passage deals with the Torah. The second part of the portion deals with those foods that are prohibited to eat, and i.e. the animals that are not kosher, and also in abbreviated form deals with the laws of purity and impurity. So then David talks about how emotional it is for a person to read this passage, and you read that on the day of the great day of day 8, suddenly we see the shocking death of Aaron's two sons. He says, I'm going to mention briefly I'm going to review exactly how we get to this point. He says, first of all, the Torah sets aside for the dedication of the temple no less than 5 different portions. Truma, Tetzaveh, Kisisa, Vayakal, Pekude. So there are 5 portions leading this up to this. Then 2 additional portions, Vayikra and Tzav, basically open up our stories, talking about the specific sacrifices that will be brought that day. And then the 7 additional days as preparation for the Mishkan. And that preparation basically brings us to where we get to in Parashas Shemini. Basically since Parashas Truma, everything is leading up to this point. And Moshe and Aaron came to the Ol Moed, and they went out and they blessed the people. Vayera kavod Hashem, and God's presence appeared towards the people. And that's where this whole passage is leading us. From those 49 gates of Tumah in Egypt, from the low level of religiosity that we had when we left Egypt, we accepted the Torah, we built the Mishkan, and specifically at that exalted moment, at that moment of incredible success, we have the death of the two sons of Aaron. In a certain sense, when we read this year, it's almost reminding that on the holiest day, the day which is called Simchat Torah, the rejoicing of the Torah, that's how we had the tremendous losses of October 7th. As we were celebrating the completion of the Torah, we had so many of our loved ones killed on that day. And so, writes David, parallel to the greatness of the expectations of that day is the greatness of the pain. How great is the pain that would fall when each of us comes to such a great spiritual heights. And at that moment of incredible spiritual heights, specifically at that moment, the sons of Aaron sinned. And that they turned from a day of incredible joy to a day of incredible national tragedy. And so he said, our sages explain in many ways, our sages struggle to explain the reason for the death of Nadav and Avihu. And he says they were struggling. He says, I'll bring for an example the words of the Midrash. So this is a Midrash he cites from Vayikra Rabbah 29. It says, Rabbi Mani Deshav, Rabbi Yoshua Desichnin, Rabbi Yochanan B'Shem Rabbi Levi Amru. They said that Aaron's sons died. Let me just say, first of all, that I know that there are people on this call, on this and studying this, who have suffered a loss, and there's no way that you could explain the loss. There's no way. So these are feeble attempts to try to find justification. And anybody who suffered a loss knows that almost no explanation will provide any comfort. I once heard a story. This is I'm taking a pause from what David said. I heard a story about the Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish, the greatest halachist of the 20th century in Israel. And the Chazon Ish, was one of his students came to him and said, a few years after the Holocaust, he said, Rebbe, can you explain to me how the Holocaust could have happened? So the Chazon Ish said, yes, but first I'm in the middle of a Tosfos. A Tosfos is a commentary on the Talmud. He said, first I'm in the middle of this Tosfos. Tosfos is basically a commentary that when you're in grade school you study. Doesn't mean it's easy, but it's, I started studying Tosfos when I was in 7th grade. It's not like nuclear physics. It's something that 7th graders are expected to be able to understand. So the Chazon Ish says to the student, first, will you learn with me this Tosfos? We're studying the Talmud now, and I'm in the middle of this Tosfos, and I don't want to stop in the middle, and then I'll answer your question. So the student came down. It turned out to be a very difficult Tosfos, and they were studying one line, and the line took 2 hours. And at the end of the 2 hours, they still didn't get it. And the student says to the Rebbe, listen, this Tosfos is too hard for me. I don't understand it, but the Rebbe distracted me because I asked you a question about the Holocaust and you said, let's learn the Tosfos. Can we go back to my question now? And the Chazon Ish said, we don't even understand one line from the Tosfos, and you want me to explain the way God works? I can't even explain one line from the Tosfos. So to my mind, that's the real explanation to the deaths. We have no explanation. How can we understand God's ways? We don't understand God's ways, but nevertheless, Chazal offered some explanations for the sin of Nadav and Avihu, and this is the big four that the Midrash mentions. The first one is because they drank wine. As it says, they drank wine when they did their service in the temple. You weren't allowed to serve God while you were drunk, and they were drunk. Number two, they weren't wearing all of the garments because they served in the temple without wearing all of the garments, the 4 priestly garments that they were supposed to be wearing. Number 3 was that they entered into the temple without first washing their hands and their legs. They hadn't purified themselves. And number 4 was they intentionally did not have any children because they had not gotten married yet at this point. They were supposed to get married. And that was the explanation. So David writes, this tremendous pain awakens over many years this desire to explain the depths of the sin that brought to such a tremendous tragedy. But we could say that the sages' explanation were taken from a deep understanding about the hidden dangers of spirituality, of unchecked spirituality, that they didn't follow the rituals, that these children, Nadav and Avihu, they deviated from the religiosity while they were doing their spirituality. And he's saying that unchecked spirituality is very dangerous. Let me just say here, I did feel a little bit uncomfortable at, I didn't write about this, but I did feel a little uncomfortable at the grave of Rebbe Milch, because there was a lot of, whenever you have thousands of people there and a spiritual place, you have some people who are clearly a little unstable. There are a couple of people drunk, a couple of people who are maybe taking things that I will never allow to go into my body. So I definitely felt more able to pray when I was at the smaller graves, like the B'nai Yissaschars and the Ravshitzers. Maybe there were less people there. I felt there I was better able to daven, and that's what David is saying here, is that they're talking about the unchecked dangers of spirituality. They didn't wash their hands first. They drank wine before entering into the temple. And he's saying that that's dangerous. However, he says in this case, we can explain the basis for the sin based upon the literal verses, because it says they each took their fire pan and they brought with them a foreign fire that was not commanded. So the Torah mentions their sin in other places. It mentions specifically that they brought a foreign fire, asher lo tziva otam, that God did not command them. Nevertheless, the Torah says that their death came as a result of deviating from what God commanded them to do. And so therefore, when the Torah connects the death of Aaron directly to the dedication of the temple, the essence of the sin gets more strength. And so basically, we have to give another reason. And we have to say, why specifically does the Torah tell us by putting the death of Nadav and Avihu directly on the day of the dedication? So he now turns to the Hasidic explanation. And so therefore, he says, the Hasidic explanation says that the most important thing is that when a person does a mitzvah, they have to have the proper intent. A person needs to work so hard so that all of his commandments have no foreign thoughts or ulterior motives. We have to do the mitzvahs only for the sake of heaven and only for the sake of pure spiritual approach to God, and not from any specific interest. He says specifically at that moment, that exalted moment where God is putting his divine presence onto the Jewish people, the Torah saw a specific need to teach this main idea specifically about intent. At that moment, the Torah said that if their intent was a little bit off, then the consequences will be tragic. And so therefore, the Torah says that was not commanded, meaning to say, at the end of the day, a person needs to come with the pure spiritual thoughts and not with a person's own private agenda. This idea that where a person comes with their own interest is very dangerous, and a person cannot understand the great danger that's in it, because it looks like he's doing God's will. But a person thinks, oh, I'm elevating the mitzvah, I'm doing it to make it better, but really, it's incredibly dangerous. That's what David is saying. And especially at those greatest moments where a person deviates, that's where you have the greatest spiritual danger. I will say that I just tell you that before I went to the grave of Rebbe Melech, I sent a message to David's wife, Meital. He said, I want you to know I'm going to go to Rebbe Melech's grave and I'm going to daven for you. I lit a candle. And she said she knows that if David was around, he would definitely want to come with me. And she would have gotten into an argument with him. She would have told him, don't go, it's idolatry. And he would have said, no, it's not like that, I'm going to go. And so it was, and David's father actually used to, many times went to Rebbe Melech's kever. So he's saying, especially at these moments where you have like these spiritual, ecstatic moments, that's where you especially have to be careful. That's where you have to be especially careful, not to have exalted, to place yourself above others, and place yourself above others. So this is what we'll teach from David this week. If anybody has any questions before we stop and go on to the Jai Rubin, let me know. Hold on, yes.